The rumble was a constant, a low growl in the bones of the earth that had become the rhythm of Silas's own blood. For 2 days, the freight train had been his world, a rattling iron serpent cutting a dead straight line through a landscape bleached by a relentless sun. Outside the open doors of the boxcar, the desert stretched into a shimmering, heat-hazed infinity. The sky was a vast, empty bowl of pale, washed-out blue, a color that offered no comfort, no promise of rain or relief. Dust, finer than any flower, was the third passenger in the car. It coated the rough wooden floorboards, settled in the creases of Silas's worn duster, and created a gritty film on his tongue. It was the taste of this land, patience, and decay. Silas sat on a stack of burlap sacks filled with something heavy and unyielding, perhaps seed or salt. He was a man built of long lines and hard angles, from the sharp cut of his jaw, stubbled with days of growth, to the length of his legs, which were stretched out before him. Boots crossed at the ankles. His hat, a dark felt stained with sweat and time, was pulled low. Shadowing eyes that missed nothing but revealed little. They were the color of slate, accustomed to scanning long horizons and judging the character of a man or a horse in a single, unhurried glance. He was not old, perhaps 30 years of hard living etched onto his face, but he possessed a stillness that usually came with age, a conservation of movement that spoke of a life where wasted energy could be the difference between supper and an empty belly. He had boarded the train in a town whose name he hadn't bothered to learn, and would ride it until he felt the urge to get off. It was a pattern he knew well. He was a man accustomed to the company of the wind and the sun, and the hollow loneliness of his own thoughts was a familiar, worn blanket. The clatter of the wheels on the steel tracks was a hypnotic beat, da-dum, 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 a sound that could lull a man to sleep or drive him mad. For Silas, it was simply a sound that filled the void, a mechanical heartbeat in a dead world. He had chosen the last car for this very reason. It was a place of endings, of things left behind. The chances of being disturbed were slim. Most men, whether they were paying customers or stowaways, preferred the cars closer to the engine, closer to the illusion of progress and company. Here, there was only the receding track and the endless, indifferent dust. He was watching a hawk circle high above, a black speck riding the thermal currents, when a new sound broke the rhythm. It wasn't the train. It was a grating, metallic screech from the car's sliding door, the one he'd left slightly ajar for a sliver of air. It was a sound of desperation, of metal being forced against its will. Silas didn't flinch, but his body went rigid. The stillness was no longer passive. It was coiled, watchful. His hand, which had been resting loosely on his knee, now lay flat, fingers slightly splayed, a breath away from the holstered Colt at his hip. The door shuddered open another foot, and a figure stumbled through the opening, framed for a moment against the blinding white glare of the desert. It was a girl, or a young woman. It was hard to tell. She was a whirlwind of ragged motion and panicked breath, her chest heaving as if she had run for miles. She slammed the heavy door shut behind her, the boom echoing in the cavernous space, and leaned against it, her eyes screwed shut as she fought for air. Silas remained motionless, a shadow in the corner. He took her in, piece by piece. Her dress, a simple calico of a faded blue pattern, was torn at the hem, shredded as if by thorns and sharp rocks. A long, dark smudge of dirt ran down one side of her skirt, and one of her sleeves was ripped at the shoulder, revealing a pale sliver of skin beneath. Her hair, the color of sun-dried straw, had escaped its pins and hung in wild, tangled strands around a face that was pale with exhaustion and smudged with grime. In her hands, she clutched a small cloth satchel, her knuckles white and bloodless, holding it to her chest like a shield. Her eyes flew open, wide and frantic, like those of a cornered deer. They darted around the shadowed interior of the boxcar, searching, assessing. They were blue, he noted distantly. the clear, bright blue of a spring sky. But right now they were clouded with sheer, undiluted terror. When they finally landed on him, she froze. A small, choked gasp escaped her lips. She had traded one danger for another, and the realization seemed to drain the last of her strength. She sagged against the door, her body trembling. Silas did not move. He did not speak. To do so would be to startle her, and he knew the look of a creature pushed to the very edge of its endurance. One wrong move, one sharp word, and she might bolt, right back out into the sun-scorched hell she had just escaped. So he waited. He let the rhythmic clatter of the train fill the silence between them, giving her a moment to let her hammering heart slow, to recognize that he was not an immediate threat. Her gaze remained fixed on him, her breath still coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He could see the calculation in her eyes, the desperate weighing of odds. A lone man in an empty boxcar was a risk, a terrible one, but whatever was behind her was a certainty. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed herself away from the door. She took one hesitant step, then another, moving as if the floor might give way beneath her. The worn floorboards creaked under her slight weight. She stopped halfway across the car, the small satchel still pressed to her chest. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She swallowed, a visible effort in the slender column of her throat. "Please," she finally whispered. Her voice was a dry, rasping thing, thin and fragile as a moth's wing. It was barely audible over the noise of the train. "Please, Mr." Silas remained silent, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. He offered no encouragement, no denial. He simply watched, waited for her to state her purpose. Questions were a luxury, a currency he rarely dealt in. They invited stories, and stories invited trouble. She took another shaky step closer. She was close enough now that he could see the fine tremor in her hands, the way her gaze kept flicking back towards the door she had just sealed. They're looking for me," she stammered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "On the train. They'll be checking the cars." He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an offer of help. It was a simple acknowledgement of a fact. Of course they would. Tears welled in her eyes, turning the blue to a shimmering, desperate silver, but she did not let them fall. She blinked them back with a fierce determination that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance. This one was a fighter. He thought, a survivor. I need to hide." Her eyes searched his face, looking for a flicker of pity, of kindness, of anything but the cold indifference she saw there. Finding none, her desperation seemed to peak. Her gaze fell from his face to the heavy canvas duster that covered him from shoulder to knee. An idea, born of pure animal panic, sparked in her eyes. It was a mad, foolish idea, but it was the only one she had. She took the final steps that separated them, her movements clumsy with haste, and stopped just before his outstretched boots. She sank to her knees on the dusty floorboards, a gesture of supplication that was both heartbreaking and absolute. "Please," she whispered again, her voice cracking. "Let me hide, under your coat, just till they pass. They won't look for a girl under a man's coat." For the first time, a flicker of something moved in Silas's stony expression. It wasn't surprise, not exactly. It was a quiet assessment of the sheer, raw nerve of her request. She was asking for more than concealment. She was asking for trust. She was placing her life, her fate, into the hands of a complete stranger, a man who could be anything: a thief, a killer, or worse. She was betting everything on the chance that he was not the monster she was fleeing from. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. The train rattled on, oblivious. The desert streamed past, uncaring, in that small, enclosed world. There were only the two of them, a desperate plea hanging in the thick, dusty air. He saw her story in her eyes, not the details, but the shape of it, the fear, the pain, The running. He didn't need to know her name or her past. He saw a creature in a trap, chewing off its own leg to get free. He did not speak. Words were unnecessary. With a slow, fluid motion that was economical and precise, he leaned forward slightly. He took the dusty lapel of his duster in one hand and lifted it, creating a dark, cavernous space beside his leg. It was not a grand gesture. It was a simple, practical act. An opening, an invitation into the shadows. A sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her lips, a sound she quickly stifled with the back of her hand. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled forward on her knees, ducking under the heavy fabric without a sound. She curled herself into the smallest possible ball, her back pressing against the rough burlap of the sacks, her side pressed against the unyielding warmth of his leg through his denim trousers. The satchel was cradled protectively in her arms. Silas let the coat fall back into place. The heavy canvas settled over her, erasing her from sight completely. To any casual observer, he was once again a man sitting alone in a boxcar. A little bulkier, perhaps, but the voluminous cut of the duster disguised it well. He settled back against the sacks, his posture unchanged. His hand returned to his knee. His gaze went back to the open slice of the doorway, to the endless sun-scoured land beyond. Nothing in his demeanor had changed, but everything was different. He could feel the slight, trembling weight of her against his leg. He could feel the warmth of her body, the faint, shallow rhythm of her breathing. He was no longer alone. He had, without a word, accepted a burden, a dangerous, unknown, and trembling burden. The train rolled on, its wheels hammering out their relentless rhythm, carrying them deeper into the vast, silent heart of the West. For a time that stretched into an eternity, the darkness under the coat was Ellie's entire world. It smelled of dust, sweat, and the faint, clean scent of sage that seemed to cling to the man's clothes. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was magnified, a deafening thunder that vibrated through the floor, up Silas's leg and into her own huddled body. She kept her eyes squeezed shut, trying to will herself into invisibility, her cheek pressed against the rough denim of his trousers. Each beat of the train was a beat of her own terrified heart. She focused on the solid, unmoving presence of the man beside her, a strange anchor in a sea of fear. He had not shifted, had not so much as cleared his throat. He was a mountain of stillness, and for now, she was a frightened creature hiding in its shadow. The change, when it came, was subtle. A slight shift in the train's cadence, a long, mournful squeal of brakes that was different from the usual slowing for a grade. It was the sound of an unscheduled stop. Ellie's breath hitched in her throat. She felt Silas's thigh muscle tense beneath her cheek. He had noticed it too. Outside, the sounds of the open desert were replaced by the hiss of steam and the crunch of heavy boots on the gravel beside the tracks. Voices, they were muffled at first, carried on the hot wind. Gruff, impatient male voices, then closer. A loud, violent crash echoed from a few cars up the sound of a boxcar door being thrown open. Another crash followed, nearer this time. They were searching, systematically. Her blood ran cold. She pressed herself tighter against Silas, trying to shrink, to melt into the floorboards. A shadow fell across the sliver of light from the main door. The grating shriek of metal on metal ripped through the air as their car door was violently yanked aside. Blinding, brutal sunlight flooded the space, forcing Ellie to screw her eyes shut even within her dark cocoon. "Anything," a voice barked. It was coarse, like stones grinding together. "Nothing but a damn drifter," a second voice replied. Closer. Heavy footsteps thumped on the wooden floor just inside the doorway. Ellie could feel the vibration. She held her breath until her lungs burned, certain the frantic hammering in her chest was loud enough for the whole world to hear. "Get a look at him," the first voice commanded. There was a pause. Through the thick fabric of the duster, Ellie could feel Silas shift, not in fear, but with a deliberate, slow indolence. He made a low, guttural sound, the noise of a man annoyed at being woken from a nap. "He's just some bum," the second man said with disgust. "Let's keep moving. If the girl's on this train, she ain't in here." The footsteps retreated. The door slammed shut with a deafening boom, plunging the car back into dusty twilight. The train lurched, then slowly began to pick up speed, the familiar dudum, dudum resuming its rhythm. A wave of dizzying relief washed over Ellie. She almost let out a sob, a ragged gasp of thanks. They were gone. It was over. But before the sound could escape her lips, a hand clamped down on her shoulder from outside the coat. It wasn't a comforting touch. It was a grip of iron, a silent, urgent command. Silas's stillness was gone, replaced by a terrifying new energy. In one fluid, powerful movement, he rose, pulling her up with him. She stumbled out from under the duster, blinking in the dim light, her legs stiff and clumsy. He was already moving toward the back of the car, his eyes fixed on the rear sliding door, his face a mask of grim purpose. "What?" she started to whisper, but he cut her off with a sharp, backward jerk of his head. He didn't need to speak. His urgency was a physical force, pulling her along in his wake. They hadn't been fooled. He knew it. He had sensed it in their voices, in the way they had dismissed him too quickly. They were just clearing the cars before coming back for a more thorough search, trapping anyone who had hidden. He reached the rear door and his hands went to the heavy iron latch. It was thick with rust and disuse. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with effort as he fought the corroded metal. For a heart-stopping second, it refused to budge. Ellie's gaze darted from the stubborn latch to the front of the car, expecting the other door to fly open at any moment. Then, with a loud, groaning crack, the latch gave way. Silas heaved the door open. The world exploded into a roar of wind and noise. The ground below was a dizzying, terrifying blur of rock, sand, and thorny scrub, rushing past at a speed that seemed impossible to survive. The wind tore at her hair and clothes, trying to suck the breath from her lungs. It was like looking over the edge of a cliff into a raging river of earth. Ellie froze, her feet rooted to the floor. Her mind screamed, "Jump into that, it was suicide." Every instinct for self-preservation rebelled against the very idea. She could see the individual rocks now, the sharp edges, the skeletal remains of dead bushes. It was a death trap. Silas glanced back, not at her face, but at the front of the train. He must have heard or seen something she didn't, because his expression hardened into pure, unyielding resolve. He turned to her, his slate-gray eyes locking onto hers. There was no time for persuasion, no room for fear. He grabbed her, his arm wrapping around her waist like a steel band, pulling her flush against his side. She was so consumed by terror she barely registered the contact. "Tuck your head," he yelled over the roar. "When we hit, roll!" He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't give her a choice. With her pressed against him, he took one more decisive step and launched them out into the void. The fall was a split second of weightless panic. Then came the impact. It was not a single, clean hit, but a brutal, chaotic explosion of pain. The world dissolved into a spinning vortex of grit and agony. Silas had twisted in midair, ensuring his body took the brunt of the landing. His shoulder and hip hit the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud that knocked the air from both of them in a shared, silent scream. They were a tangle of limbs, rolling and tumbling through a landscape of razors. Gravel tore at their skin. The brittle, thorny branches of creosote bushes ripped at their clothes and flesh. Ellie's head was tucked against his chest as he'd ordered, and his arm was a protective shield, but nothing could stop the violent, jarring punishment of the fall. The world was noise, pain, and the taste of blood and dust in her mouth. They finally slid to a halt in a cloud of their own dust at the bottom of a shallow, gravel-strewn slope. For a moment, there was nothing, just the ringing in her ears and a universe of searing pain from the tracks above, Now, rapidly receding, came the faint sound of a triumphant shout. They had been seen. Before Ellie could even process that they were alive, Silas was moving. He pushed himself up with a groan, his face pale and tight with pain. Blood trickled from a cut on his temple. He grabbed her arm, his touch surprisingly steady, and hauled her to her feet. Her ankles screamed in protest, and she cried out, stumbling against him. "Can you walk?" he grunted, his eyes already scanning the terrain. I think so," she gasped, testing her weight on the injured ankle. It held, but barely. "Good enough." He pointed to a deep, jagged scar in the earth 100 yards away. A dry wash, an arroyo carved by forgotten flash floods. "There, move." He didn't let her go, half dragging, half supporting her. He set off at a limping, desperate run toward the gully. Every step sent a jolt of fire up Ellie's leg. But the fear of the men who would surely be coming back for them was a sharper pain. They scrambled and slid down the steep, sandy bank of the arroyo, landing in the relative cover of its winding channel. The train was now just a black line in the distance. They were hidden from the tracks, but for how long? Silas didn't pause. "They'll follow the tracks back. We need to get off this line." He looked around, his gaze sharp and calculating. The bottom of the wash was littered with debris-smooth stones, old branches, and clumps of dried brush. "They'll look for tracks leading away from the jump site. We need to give them the wrong ones." He began to move with a feverish intensity, gathering the driest, most flammable-looking tumbleweeds and branches, piling them up against the bank of the arroyo, a good 50 feet from where they stood. Ellie watched, confused and breathing in ragged gulps. What was he doing? From a small leather pouch on his belt, he produced a small tin. He knelt beside the pile of brush, his back to her, and she heard a sharp, repeated clicking sound. A tiny spark glowed in the shadows of his cupped hands. He blew on it gently, expertly, and a small, fragile flame sprang to life. He fed it to the driest tinder. The desert foliage, baked by years of sun, caught with an explosive whoosh. A thick column of oily, white smoke billowed upwards, a stark signal against the clear blue sky. The wind caught it immediately, pushing it north, away from them, creating a perfect, deceptive screen. "The smoke will draw them," he said, his voice low and raspy. He grabbed her arm again. "They'll think we went that way. We go south. Now, keep low and stay quiet." He led them away from the fire, deeper into the protective maze of the arroyo. They moved for what felt like hours. The initial rush of adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, throbbing ache in every muscle and bone. Ellie's ankle was a ball of fire, and she leaned heavily on Silas, who bore her weight without complaint, though she could see the strain in the tight set of his jaw. The sun beat down on them, a merciless hammer in the sky. The world shrank to the simple, agonizing rhythm of survival, one foot in front of the other. The crunch of their boots on the sandy floor of the wash, the sound of their own labored breathing, the vast, oppressive silence of the desert. As the sun began to cast long, distorted shadows, turning the ochre rock to a deep, bruised purple, Silas finally called a halt. He found a place where the arroyo wall had been deeply undercut by the water, creating a shallow overhang of rock that offered some concealment and shade. He eased her down to the ground, her back against the cool stone, before slumping down beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the whisper of the evening wind through the rocks and their own ragged breaths. Slowly evening out, they were alive, battered, bruised, caked in dirt and blood, but alive. Silas finally turned his head and looked at her. His gaze was intense, sweeping over her not with any personal interest, but with the practical eye of a man assessing damage. He noted the torn dress, the scrapes on her arms, the way she favored her swollen ankle. Ellie met his gaze. In the fading light, his slate-gray eyes seemed darker, deeper. They held no softness, no pity, But they held something else, a shared experience, a grim understanding. He had seen her fear, and she had seen his competence. He had risked his life for a complete stranger, and she had placed her life entirely in his hands. No words of thanks were offered. They would have sounded hollow and inadequate in the vast silence. No questions were asked. The answers did not matter. In that long, silent look, as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, something shifted between them. A fragile connection, forged in terror and violence, was spun in the space between two breaths. It was not trust, not yet. It was not friendship. It was something more elemental. The simple, profound recognition of two people who had leaped into the abyss together and, against all odds, had survived. The dawn broke cold and sharp, painting the eastern rim of the canyon in shades of bruised purple and delicate rose. Pain was the first thing to greet Ellie as she awoke. A dull, throbbing map of every rock and thorn she had collided with. Her ankle was a swollen, angry knot. Beside her, Silas was already awake, though he hadn't moved. He sat propped against the rock wall, his hat tipped low, watching the light creep down the canyon walls. He looked less like a man who had slept and more like a predator who had rested, his stillness charged with a low, constant vigilance. He must have sensed her stirring. Without turning his head, he spoke, his voice a low rasp in the morning quiet. "Can you stand?" She pushed herself up, biting back a groan as her muscles protested. The world tilted for a moment. "Yes," she managed, though the single word was an act of will. He nodded once, a gesture of grim satisfaction. He pushed himself to his feet with an economy of motion that belied his own stiffness. He moved over to her and knelt, his calloused fingers gently probing the swollen flesh of her ankle. His touch was impersonal, clinical, but it was the first time in a very long time anyone had touched her with anything resembling care. She flinched, not from pain, but from the strangeness of the sensation. "It's not broken," he pronounced, his diagnosis as spare as his conversation. He tore a long strip from the hem of his own dusty shirt, the sound of the ripping fabric unnaturally loud in the silence, with practiced efficiency. He bound her ankle, his wrapping firm and supportive. He worked without looking at her face, his entire focus on the task. When he was done, he stood and offered her a hand. After a brief hesitation, she took it. His grip was firm and dry, and he pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. The journey that followed was a blur of silent endurance. Silas set a slow but relentless pace, leading them out of the arroyo and into a landscape of low, rolling hills dotted with juniper and sage. He seemed to know the land intimately, reading the contours of the earth, choosing paths that offered the most cover and the surest footing. He never looked back to see if she was following. He simply assumed she would, that her will to survive was as strong as his own. For Ellie, every step was an agony. Her ankle throbbed with each beat of her heart, and the cuts and bruises from their fall made their presence known with every movement. The sun climbed higher, beating down on them, and the world seemed to shimmer and warp in the heat. She focused on the back of the man in front of her, a broad, steady shape in a faded blue shirt. His silence was a strange comfort. A talkative man would have offered false reassurances or asked questions she couldn't answer. Silas offered only his presence, a steady, unyielding force moving forward, and so she followed, putting one foot in front of the other, her world shrinking to that simple, desperate act. Late in the afternoon, when Ellie felt she could not take another step, they crested a final, rocky ridge. Silas stopped, and she came to a halt beside him, leaning on a sun-warmed boulder, her chest heaving. Below them, nestled in a shallow, wide valley, was a homestead. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen. A small, sturdy cabin of weathered gray timber stood beside a leaning barn whose wood had been scoured to silver by the sun and wind. A simple corral, holding a single, sturdy-looking buckskin horse, was attached to the barn, a short distance away. A windmill turned with a slow, rhythmic creak, its blades catching the afternoon light. There were no other signs of life. No neighboring ranches, no distant curl of smoke, no road leading to or from the property. It was an island of human endeavor in a vast, empty sea of grass and rock. The isolation was absolute. Part of her recoiled from the stark loneliness of it, while another, deeper part felt a profound, illogical sense of relief. No one would find her here. As they made their way down the gentle slope, the cabin door swung open and a boy appeared. He was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with a shock of unruly brown hair and a face smudged with dirt. He wore trousers that were a little too short and a shirt that was a little too big, and he was barefoot. He stood on the porch, watching their approach with an unnerving, solemn curiosity. When he saw Silas's limp and the blood on his temple, his face clouded with concern. "Silas, you're hurt," the boy said, his voice clear and surprisingly steady. He ran down the steps to meet them, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of Ellie, ragged and exhausted, clinging to Silas's arm for support. "Met with some trouble, Tom," Silas said, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "This is, well, she'll be staying a spell." The boy, Tom, looked from Silas to Ellie, his gaze frank and inquisitive. He didn't ask who she was or where she came from. He simply accepted it. "Her leg is hurt too," he observed, pointing to her bandaged ankle. "It is," Silas confirmed. "Let's get inside." The interior of the cabin was as stark and practical as the man who lived in it. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A rough-hewn wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room. Against the far wall were 2 simple cots, each with a neatly folded woolen blanket. Shelves held a sparse collection of tins, sacks of flour and beans, a few chipped plates, and a small, worn collection of books. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and dry herbs. It was not a home, not in the way Ellie had ever understood the word. It was a shelter, a fortress, a place pared down to the essentials of survival. But it was clean, and the thick log walls seemed to shut out the harshness of the world outside. Silas gestured for Ellie to sit at the table, then went to a bucket by the door and ladled water into a basin. He brought it over, along with a clean cloth and a small tin of dark, pungent salve, wordlessly. He knelt and began to clean the scrapes on her arms and face. Ellie sat rigid, unused to such attention. The sting of the water on her raw skin was sharp, but she didn't make a sound. When he was done, he nodded towards the basin. "See to your own feet," while she soaked her aching feet in the cool water. Tom brought her a tin cup of water, which she drank down in greedy gulps. The boy sat opposite her, watching her with his serious eyes. "Silas found me up in the mountains 2 years ago," he said suddenly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to share. "My folks, their wagon went over. He brought me here." Ellie looked from the boy to Silas, who was now checking the action on his rifle by the fading light of the window. There was no flicker of acknowledgement on the man's face, but the boy's simple statement hung in the air, adding another layer to the silent man she knew nothing about. "We got chickens," Tom continued, his initial solemnity giving way to a more natural boyishness. "And Buck, that's the horse. Silas says he's got more sense than most men he knows. Sometimes we check the traps. Sometimes we just fix things. There's always something needs fixin'." The simple litany of their lives was so foreign, so peaceful, it felt like a story from another world. As Tom chattered on, Ellie began to move. She couldn't just sit there, a useless burden. Spotting the small stack of dirty dishes from what must have been the morning meal, she got to her feet, testing her wrapped ankle. It was painful, but it held. She began to wash the plates in the basin, her movements slow and deliberate. Silas glanced over at her, his expression unreadable, but he said nothing to stop her. The simple, domestic act of washing dishes felt grounding. It was work. It was useful. It was normal. after a lifetime of being treated as a commodity, an object to be bartered or possessed. The simple dignity of a useful task was a balm to her fractured soul. As dusk settled over the valley, the world outside the cabin's single window turned a deep, velvety blue. Silas lit a single oil lamp, and its warm, yellow glow pushed back the encroaching shadows, creating a small circle of light in the vast, dark wilderness. He put a pot of coffee on the hearth to boil and began slicing thick slabs of bacon into a skillet. The smell filled the small space, a scent of sustenance and normalcy that made Ellie's stomach ache with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. She sat on the edge of the porch, her chores done, and watched the stars emerge, impossibly bright in the black sky. Tom sat beside her, whittling a piece of wood into a crude animal shape. Inside, Silas moved with a quiet efficiency, the clatter of the skillet a comforting, domestic sound. The vast, empty landscape that had seemed so threatening now felt like a protective embrace. The silence that had been so unnerving now seemed peaceful. For the first time since she had climbed onto that train, the tight, cold knot of fear in her belly began to loosen its grip. The men who were hunting her were out there, somewhere in the vastness, but they felt a world away. Here, within the circle of light cast by the cabin, with a silent man who had jumped from a train for her and a boy who accepted her without question. She was not running. She was still. It was not safety. She knew that. It was a reprieve, a temporary harbor in a storm that was surely not over. But as she drew the cool night air into her lungs, it felt like the same thing. It was a feeling so new, so fragile, that she was almost afraid to name it. Afraid the word itself would shatter the spell. But it was there, settling over her like one of the warm woolen blankets on the cots inside, a sense of peace, a chance to breathe. The days settled into a quiet, fragile rhythm, a routine, so foreign to Ellie's life of constant motion and fear, began to take root in the small, isolated valley. Mornings were for chores, a silent dance of shared tasks. Silas would head to the barn before dawn, his movements quiet but purposeful. Ellie would tend to the small fire, put the coffee on to boil, and feed the handful of chickens that scratched in the dirt behind the cabin. Tom, a boy who seemed to have an endless supply of quiet energy, would follow one or the other of them, a small shadow offering help with a seriousness that was both charming and a little sad. In these quiet days, Ellie learned Silas through his actions. He was a man who spoke with his hands. He mended a broken fence post with the focused patience of a surgeon, his movements economical and precise. He treated the horse, Buck, with a gruff tenderness, murmuring to the animal in a low voice she could never quite make out. He taught Tom how to set a snare, not with a long lecture, but by guiding the boy's small hands, letting him feel the tension of the rope and the proper way to tie the knot. He never offered praise, but a small, quiet nod from him would make the boy's chest swell with pride. Ellie observed it all, her watchfulness a habit she couldn't break. She felt like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, a stray dog taken in from the rain, constantly looking for signs that she was about to be cast out again. But there were no such signs. Silas treated her presence as a simple fact, like the rising of the sun or the direction of the wind. He never asked about her past, and she never offered it. The unspoken agreement was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark body of water. The breaking point came on the fourth evening. A storm had rolled in from the plains, a dramatic display of dark, bruised clouds and distant, rumbling thunder. They ate their supper of beans and bacon in the warm, flickering light of the lantern, the sound of the rising wind a low moan around the corners of the cabin. Tom, exhausted from a day of helping Silas retar a section of the barn roof, had fallen asleep almost as soon as he'd finished his meal. Silas had carried him to his cot and covered him with a blanket, a gesture of paternal care so natural it made Ellie's throat tighten. Now, only the two of them were awake. The wind howled outside, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the single glass window pane. The sound seemed to amplify the silence within the cabin. Ellie was washing the tin plates in a basin of hot water, and Silas stood beside her, a dry cloth in his hands, taking each plate as she finished and wiping it clean. They had done this every night, a simple, shared task that marked the end of the day. Tonight, however, the silence felt different. It was heavier, charged with the energy of the storm outside and the unspoken truths between them. Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a plate. She felt his eyes on her, though when she risked a glance, he was looking down at the plate in his own hands, his expression as impassive as ever. It was the quiet constancy of his presence, the simple, undemanding way he had offered her shelter, that finally wore down her defenses. She could no longer bear being a ghost in his home, a woman without a name or a history. He had jumped from a moving train for her. He had tended her wounds. He deserved to know the nature of the trouble he had taken into his house. "You never asked," she said, her voice so low it was nearly lost in a gust of wind that rattled the door. Silas didn't look up. He continued to polish the clean plate with slow, circular motions. "Asking's not my way." "But you should know," she insisted, scrubbing the same plate over and over. "You should know who you're sheltering." He took the plate from her hands, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. He said nothing. He simply waited, his silence an invitation, a canvas on which she could paint her story if she chose. And so she did. The words came out in a halting, quiet rush, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a history lesson she had memorized long ago. "My name is Eleanor Vance. Ellie," she began. "My father, he was a good man, once, before the drink took him. After my mother passed, he started losing pieces of himself. First the farm, then his pride." She paused, placing the last of the forks into the basin. The water had grown cold. "He had debts, to a man named Marcus Finch. Mr. Finch is a man who builds his fortune on the misfortunes of others. He lends money, and when a man can't pay, he takes whatever is left, land, livestock, anything of value." She finally risked looking at him. His face was shadowed, his expression unreadable. He had stopped wiping the plate and was simply holding it, listening. "My father ran out of things for him to take," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "So he offered the last thing he had. He offered me to settle the account, to work in Mr. Finch's house until the debt was paid." The ugly words hung in the air between them. Sold. She didn't have to say it. He would understand. She expected to see disgust in his eyes, or perhaps pity. She saw neither. He just stood there, a statue of quiet attention. Mr. Finch was not a kind man. She said, the understatement a testament to the horrors she could not bring herself to voice. He believed that what he paid for, he owned completely. He liked his property to be obedient. I stayed for 6 months, every day. I looked for a way out. She drew a shaky breath, her gaze falling to the small, tightly bound cloth satchel that she never let out of her sight, which now rested by her feet. He kept a ledger, a little black book where he wrote down all his business, not just the legal loans, but the other things, the threats, the crooked deals, the names of important men who owed him favors, the kind of things that, if a lawman ever saw them, would put him away for a very long time. It was his power. She reached down and touched the satchel, her knuckles white. "I took it 2 weeks ago. I took his book and whatever money I could find, and I ran. Those men on the train, they work for him. They weren't just sent to bring me back. They were sent to bring the book back. He cares more about that ledger than he ever did about me." She finished, and the silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the roof. She had laid her entire, sordid story at his feet. She had confessed to being the daughter of a weak man, the property of a cruel one, and a thief. She waited for his judgment, for the revulsion, for the cold, hard words that would tell her to leave at first light. Silas did not speak. He took the last wet fork from the basin, dried it with meticulous care, and placed it with the others. He then emptied the basin out the back door into the rain-swept darkness before hanging it on its peg. The simple, domestic tasks were his only reply. He moved with the same unhurried pace as always, as if she had just been commenting on the weather. The lack of response was a unique kind of agony. Ellie's shoulders slumped. Of course, he didn't need to say anything. His silence was its own verdict. She was trouble, and he was a man who valued a quiet life. She had brought a storm to his door, both literally and figuratively. He turned from the wall, his boots making a soft sound on the floorboards. He walked not towards her, but towards the cabin's sturdiest chair, a simple wooden armchair with a worn, padded seat. He lifted it, and for a moment, she thought he meant to break it over his knee in a fit of rage. Instead, he carried it to the front door, opened it, and placed the chair in the most sheltered corner of the covered porch, where the rain could not reach it. He then went to his own cot, took the thicker of the 2 woolen blankets, and walked back outside. He draped the blanket over the chair, smoothing it down with his large, calloused hands. Finally, he turned and looked at her, his face illuminated by the soft lamplight. His expression was unchanged. He had heard her confession, weighed it, and moved on. "Wind will die down soon," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Air's clean after a rain. You'll rest easier out here." Ellie stared at him, unable to comprehend. He wasn't telling her to leave. He wasn't judging her. He had heard the ugliest truths about her life, and his response was to make her a more comfortable place to sleep. He was offering her not absolution, not pity, but something far more valuable, a safe place to rest her head, a moment of peace in the clean, rain-washed air. He was acknowledging her burden, the weight she carried, and telling her, in his own silent way, that she could set it down for the night. She walked past him, out onto the porch. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage. She sank into the chair he had prepared for her. The blanket was warm and smelled faintly of him. She pulled it around her shoulders, a shield against the chill of the night and the deeper chill of her past. She watched as he stood at the edge of the porch, looking out into the dark, rain-streaked valley, a solitary, unmovable figure against the storm. He had not offered her a single word of comfort. He had not promised her protection. He had simply heard her truth and then, with his own 2 hands, had given her a place of sanctuary. It was not a promise spoken in words, but a truth demonstrated in action. And in the vast, lonely quiet of the Wild West, it was the only kind of truth that mattered. The confession, once spoken, did not shatter the quiet of the valley. Instead, it settled it. The story, released from the confines of Ellie's heart, seemed to dissolve into the vast, open air, leaving behind not a scar, but a clean, quiet space. The terrible weight of her secrets had been a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her days. Now, in the silence that followed Silas's acceptance, a different kind of quiet emerged. It was a silence that was not empty, but full of a gentle, growing peace. In this new stillness, the world began to come into focus for Ellie. Before, she had seen the landscape as a series of threats and hiding places. Now, she began to see it as a living, breathing thing. She started to notice the small miracles she had been blind to. She saw the way the early morning sun caught the dew on a spider's web, turning it into a net of diamonds. She learned to distinguish the sharp, cheerful cry of the wren from the lonely, looping call of the hawk. She discovered that the sagebrush, which she had thought of only as a dull, gray-green scrub, released a clean, sharp, beautiful scent after a rain, a perfume that spoke of resilience and renewal. The valley was no longer a prison or a temporary hiding place. It was slowly, imperceptibly, becoming a sanctuary. Life continued in its simple, rhythmic pattern, a meditation of chores and sustenance. Yet, within this pattern, a new language began to form between them, a dialect of gestures and deeds spoken in the quiet moments between the rising and the setting of the sun. It was a language without words, built of small, seemingly insignificant acts that, when woven together, created a tapestry of profound and tender meaning. It began with a flower. One afternoon, while checking a line of snares with Tom, her now healed ankle carrying her with a new confidence, Ellie wandered from the path. In the shade of a cluster of rust-colored boulders, growing in a small patch of soil that had collected in a crevice, was a single, defiant flower. It was a mariposa lily, its 3 petals a delicate, creamy white, painted at their base with a splash of deep, royal purple. It was a thing of impossible, fragile beauty in a land of rock and thorn. It had fought for its life, found its hold, and bloomed against all odds. She stood looking at it for a long time. It felt like looking at a reflection of a hope she hadn't dared to feel. On impulse, she knelt and plucked the flower, its stem slender and cool against her fingers. Tom was busy chasing a lizard a short distance away. This small act of beauty felt intensely private, a secret she held in the palm of her hand. All the way back to the cabin, she sheltered it from the wind, the delicate petals a stark contrast to her own calloused, work-worn fingers. Back at the homestead, Silas was on the porch, meticulously cleaning his rifle, the metal parts laid out on a piece of oilcloth. He worked with an intense, quiet focus, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small, intricate pieces. For a moment, Ellie's courage failed her. What was this flimsy flower to a man like him, a man of iron and practicality? It was a foolish, sentimental gesture. She almost threw it away. But the memory of his silent, solid acceptance the night of the storm gave her strength. She walked onto the porch, her boots making a soft sound on the weathered planks. He glanced up, his slate-gray eyes acknowledging her presence, then returned to his work. She did not speak. She simply reached out and laid the small, perfect lily on the oilcloth beside the clean, dark steel of the rifle barrel. Then she turned and walked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she went to the chicken coop, her hands busy with the familiar task of scattering feed, but her mind was back on the porch. She had offered him a piece of the valley's secret beauty. She had offered him a symbol of her own budding hope. It was a gesture more vulnerable, more terrifying than any confession. Later, from the window of the cabin, she saw him. He had finished his task and was reassembling the rifle. But first, he picked up the flower. He held it with a strange gentleness, his thumb and forefinger cradling the stem as he studied the delicate, painted petals. He did not smell it or admire it in any obvious way. He simply looked at it, his expression thoughtful, still. He did not put it in a cup of water to slowly wilt. Instead, he rose and went inside the cabin to the small shelf that held his few books. He took down a small, leather-bound volume, not a printed book, but a journal or a ledger, its cover worn smooth with use. He opened it to a page somewhere in the middle, and with a care that seemed alien to his rugged nature, he laid the mariposa lily flat against the paper. He held it in place with one finger as he gently closed the cover, pressing the flower, preserving its fleeting beauty within the silent, personal history of his own life. Ellie turned away from the window, a strange, warm feeling spreading through her chest. He had understood. He had not just accepted her gift, he had honored it. He had taken her silent, fragile offering and made it a permanent part of his world. The next evening, the conversation continued. Ellie had fallen into the habit of sitting on the top step of the porch after supper, watching as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the clouds in fiery shades of orange and pink. It was her quiet time, a moment to feel the immensity of the world and her own small, safe place within it. On this evening, when she went to her usual spot, she found that the comfortable, padded armchair from inside the cabin had been moved to the exact place where she always sat. On a small, overturned crate beside it. A tin cup of cool water from the well had been placed, a few beads of condensation glistening on its side. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Tom was already asleep on his cot. Silas was nowhere in sight. She could hear the faint, rhythmic clang of a hammer from the barn where he was likely mending a piece of tack. But this was his work. He had noticed her nightly ritual. He had anticipated her presence. He had, without a word, decided she deserved more comfort than a hard wooden step. He had provided for her without being asked, without seeking thanks. She sank into the chair, her body enveloped by a comfort that was more than just physical. It was the profound, overwhelming comfort of being seen, after a lifetime spent trying to remain invisible, to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention. This quiet, gentle observation felt like a revelation. It was not the possessive gaze of Mr. Finch, or the desperate, dismissive glance of her father. It was a simple, steady seeing. He saw her, and he had acted upon that seeing with a simple, uncomplicated kindness. A tear, hot and unexpected, slid down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but the warmth remained. From that day forward, their silent language flourished, each gesture a verse in a quiet poem they were composing together. When she woke in the mornings, she would find a small pile of kindling and a few larger pieces of wood set just inside the door, a silent offering from Silas so she wouldn't have to face the pre-dawn chill. In return, she learned to listen for the sound of his boots on the path from the barn, and she would have a cup of strong, hot coffee waiting on the table for him, just the way he liked it, without him ever having to say a word. One afternoon, while mending a tear in one of his work shirts, she took her time, her stitches small and even, reinforcing the worn fabric with a care that went beyond mere function. When he wore the shirt the next day, he ran his thumb over the neat line of her needlework, a fleeting, private gesture she caught from the corner of her eye. It was his acknowledgement, his quiet thanks. He began leaving small treasures for her and Tom to find on the porch railing. A hawk's feather, perfect and unruffled. A curiously shaped stone, worn smooth by a long-forgotten river. Once, a bird's nest, blown from a tree in a storm. Its tiny, intricate weaving a marvel of natural architecture. He never presented them as gifts, merely left them to be discovered, small offerings from his world to theirs. They spoke, of course. They talked of the weather, of the scarcity of game, of whether the old well would last through a dry summer. But their real conversations were held in these quiet acts of service and observation. His mending of the loose porch step she sometimes tripped on was a sentence, her saving him the last piece of cornbread, knowing it was his favorite, was a reply. They were building a life not with promises or declarations, but with the steady, reliable mortar of mutual care. They had never said, "I'm here for you." But every sunrise brought new evidence that they were. They had never spoken the words, "I care." But the comfortable chair on the porch, the hot cup of coffee, the flower pressed between the pages of a book, they all shouted it in the vast, western silence. The peace of the valley had a way of seeping into your bones, of convincing you that the world outside its rocky rim had simply ceased to exist. It was a lie. A beautiful, fragile lie, and it was shattered in an instant. It happened in the late afternoon, under a sky the color of faded denim. The air was warm and still, filled with the lazy hum of insects and the gentle, rhythmic creak of the windmill. Ellie was in the small vegetable patch she and Tom had cultivated, her hands in the cool, dark earth, weeding around a row of struggling bean sprouts. Tom was a short distance away, meticulously constructing a dam of mud and twigs in the shallow irrigation ditch. It was a scene of such profound, ordinary peace that it felt eternal. The first sign of trouble was the horse. Buck, who had been dozing in the shade of the barn, suddenly lifted his head, his ears swiveling towards the east. A low, nervous whicker rumbled in his chest. A moment later, he stamped a hoof, his body tense. Silas emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He had been mending a piece of the windmill's pump mechanism. He didn't look at the horse. He looked at the horizon. His eyes narrowed into slits. His entire body had gone rigid, the easy calm of moments before vanishing as if it had never been. Ellie followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but the endless expanse of dry grass and distant, heat-hazed mesas. Then she saw it, a faint, dirty plume of dust, rising against the sky. It was too fast for a lone rider, too purposeful for a dust devil. It was the signature of several horses, moving at speed, moving towards them. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. The fragile piece shattered into 1,000 pieces. They had found her. Ellie. Silas's voice was low, sharp, and stripped of all warmth. It was the voice he had used on the train. "Get the boy. Inside. Now." She didn't question him. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing Tom by the hand. The boy looked up at her, his face a mask of confusion. "What is it? Ellie, is it a storm?" "Inside. Tom," she urged, her voice tight with a fear she tried desperately to conceal. She pulled him towards the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. By the time she had Tom inside and was pushing the heavy wooden bar across the door, Silas was already at the corral, his rifle in hand. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. He threw open the corral gate and gave Buck a sharp slap on the rump. "Get, boy, go." The horse, already spooked, bolted, galloping towards the hills at the far end of the valley. A decoy to draw the eye. Silas didn't watch him go. He sprinted from the corral to the corner of the barn, sinking into the shadows, the long barrel of the rifle resting on the edge of the weathered wood. He had made himself a part of the landscape, a deadly, waiting predator. Ellie pulled Tom away from the window, pushing him down onto the floor in the corner furthest from the door. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't make a sound. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide with a fear that reflected her own. The riders crested the last ridge and thundered down into the valley. There were 3 of them, even from a distance. Ellie recognized the brutal, predatory way they sat their horses. They were not cowboys or ranchers. They were hunters. They reined in 100 yards from the cabin, their horses kicking up dust, their faces hard and cruel in the afternoon sun. The man in the middle, a burly figure with a thick, dark beard, was the one she remembered from the train, the one whose voice had been like grinding stones. "Silas," the man bellowed, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "We know you're in there. You and the girl Finch sends his regards." There was no answer from the barn. We don't want you," the man shouted, his voice laced with a false, wheedling tone. "Just the girl, and what she stole, give 'em up, and we'll ride on out of here. Nobody needs to get hurt." A long, tense silence followed. Ellie held her breath, praying that Silas would stay hidden, that they would think the homestead was abandoned and leave. The crack of Silas's rifle was so loud, so sudden, that she screamed. It wasn't aimed at the men. The shot slammed into the dirt just in front of the lead rider's horse. The animal screamed and reared, almost unseating its rider. "That's your one and only warning." Silas's voice boomed from the barn, cold and flat as a tombstone. "This is private property. Turn your horses and ride out the way you came." The bearded man fought his horse under control, his face contorted with rage. "Wrong answer," he snarled. He raised his own pistol and fired wildly towards the barn. The other 2 men fanned out, dismounting and using their horses for cover as they began to advance, firing as they came. The peaceful valley erupted into a hell of noise and violence, the air filled with the sharp, cracking reports of gunfire and the angry whine of ricocheting bullets. Wood splintered from the side of the barn and the cabin walls. From her place on the floor, Ellie could see nothing, but she could hear everything. She could hear the controlled, methodical boom of Silas's rifle, a sound distinct from the frantic, angry popping of the attacker's pistols. She heard a choked cry of pain, followed by a torrent of curses. He had hit one of them. She crawled to the window and dared to peek over the sill. One of the men was on the ground, clutching his leg, trying to drag himself behind his horse. The other two were advancing, moving from the cover of the corral fence towards the barn. Silas was a phantom. He fired, then immediately moved, using the shadows and the solid structure of the barn to his advantage. He was fighting for them. For her. A man who barely knew her was laying down his life to protect her and the boy beside her. The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She saw him move to the corner of the barn, preparing to get a clear shot at the bearded man, who was now taking cover behind the water trough. But in focusing on him, Silas missed the third man, the one who had been wounded, crawling through the dust. The man raised his pistol, his arms shaking, and fired. It was not a clean shot, but it was enough. Ellie saw Silas flinch, a sudden, violent jerk of his body. He staggered back a step, his rifle clattering to the ground. A dark, wet stain blossomed on the side of his blue shirt, just below his ribs. He pressed a hand to the wound, his face a mask of shock and pain. He tried to stay on his feet, tried to reach for his fallen rifle, but his legs betrayed him. He crumpled to the ground in the dusty space between the barn and the corral. A raw, keening sound of pure despair tore itself from Ellie's throat. The protector had fallen. The bearded man let out a triumphant roar. "He's down! Get the girl!" They began to advance on Silas's fallen form, their movements confident, victorious. Inside the cabin, something inside Ellie snapped. The terror that had paralyzed her for so long was burned away in a sudden, white-hot flash of pure, unadulterated rage. They had shot him. They had shot the only man who had ever shown her a shred of decency, of selfless protection. They were going to kill him, and then they would come for her and Tom. No. Her gaze flew to the wall above the cold hearth. Hanging on 2 wooden pegs was Silas's spare weapon, a heavy, double-barreled shotgun. Its stock was dark with age, its metal barrels a dull, menacing gray. She had seen him clean it, but she had never seen him fire it. She had never fired a gun in her life. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unhook it from the pegs. The weapon was heavier than she could have imagined, cold and brutally real in her hands. She didn't know how to reload it. She didn't know how to aim it properly. She only knew that it held 2 shots. "Stay here," she said to Tom, her voice a strange, hoarse whisper she barely recognized as her own. She turned and, without a second's hesitation, lifted the bar from the door and threw it open. She burst out onto the porch, the shotgun clutched in her hands. The 2 men were halfway to Silas, their backs to her. They heard the door slam open and spun around, their faces a mixture of surprise and cruel amusement at the sight of the ragged, terrified girl with the oversized gun. "Well, look what we have here," the bearded man sneered. "Come to give yourself up, little bird." Ellie didn't answer. She raised the shotgun, the heavy barrels wavering, and tried to brace the stock against her shoulder as she had seen Silas do with his rifle. Fear was a screaming thing in her ears, but her rage was a roaring fire. She looked past them, to Silas, who was trying to push himself up, his face pale, his shirt now soaked with blood. "Get back in the house, Ellie," he grunted, the words costing him a supreme effort. "Leave him alone," she screamed at the men, her voice cracking. "Get away from him." The man laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what you gonna shoot us with that thing? You'll probably break your own shoulder." He took a step towards her, and in that moment, as Ellie's finger tightened on the trigger, another shot cracked through the valley. It came from above, from the rocky ridge that overlooked the homestead. It was a deep, powerful report, the sound of a heavy-caliber buffalo rifle. The second man, the one standing beside the bearded leader, jerked as if struck by lightning. A red flower bloomed on his chest, and he fell backward into the dust without a sound. Everyone froze. The bearded man stared at his fallen comrade, then spun around, his eyes scanning the ridge in disbelief and panic. Ellie stared, her finger still on the trigger, her mind unable to process what had just happened. On the ridge, a figure stood up from behind a cluster of rocks. It was a man, old and wiry, silhouetted against the afternoon sky. He held a rifle so long its barrel seemed to touch the clouds. "Largate," the old man's voice, thin but carrying with surprising power, echoed down the ridge. "Get out of this valley, you filth, before I send you to hell with your friend." The bearded man was no fool. He was a bully and a predator, but he was not suicidal. The fight had gone wrong. One of his men was down, another was dead. Silas was wounded, but maybe not out. A wild-eyed girl had a shotgun aimed at his chest, and now a ghost with a cannon had appeared on the high ground. He gave Ellie one last look, a look of pure, venomous hatred. Then he turned and ran. Scrambling onto his horse and digging his heels into its flanks, he galloped away, not even glancing at his fallen men, a coward fleeing a battle he had already lost. The silence that descended was deafening. The old man on the ridge began to make his way down the steep slope. Ellie let the shotgun fall from her nerveless fingers, the heavy weapon thudding to the porch. The fire of her rage was gone, leaving behind only the cold, shaking dread. She flew down the steps, her feet barely touching the ground, and ran to Silas's side. He was conscious, barely, his breathing shallow and ragged. She knelt in the dust beside him, her hands hovering over his wound, afraid to touch him, afraid of the sheer amount of blood.
"Silas,"
she whispered, her voice breaking.
"Silas, stay with me."
His eyes, clouded with pain, fluttered open and found hers. A faint, grim smile touched his lips. "You came out," he rasped. The old man, who she now saw, had a deeply lined, sun-cured face and long, gray braids, reached them. He knelt opposite Ellie, his ancient eyes assessing the wound with a practiced calm.
"He is hurt bad, Nina,"
the old man said, his voice gravelly. "We must get him inside, now. We will protect this house, together." Ellie looked from Silas's pale face to the old man's determined one, to the body of the dead man in the dust. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the valley. The battle was over, but the war for Silas's life had just begun, and in that moment, kneeling in the dirt beside the man who had saved her, a stranger who had become her protector, and a boy who had become her charge, Ellie knew that this lonely, blood-soaked piece of land was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, and she would fight to the death to defend it. The chaotic violence of the attack vanished as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than the gunfire. The world, which moments before had been a storm of noise and adrenaline, shrank to the size of the man bleeding in the dust. The old man, Raoul, moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had seen death up close many times before. His ancient, dark eyes took in the wound, his expression grim but calm. "The bullet is still in him," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "We move him now, or we lose him." Getting Silas inside the cabin was a nightmare of clumsy, desperate effort. He was a dead weight, his body limp with unconsciousness. Ellie, fueled by a terror that felt like strength, took his shoulders while Raoul took his legs. They half dragged, half carried him, leaving a dark, terrible trail in the dust. They laid him on his own cot, the rough woolen blanket quickly turning dark with his blood.
"Nina!"
Raoul's voice was sharp, cutting through the fog of her panic.
"There is no time for fear. Do you have courage?"
Ellie looked from Silas's deathly pale face to the old man's steady gaze.
"Yes,"
she breathed, the word a prayer.
"Good. Put a great pot of water on the fire, boil it, get every clean cloth you can find, and bring me the lantern."
The hours that followed were a waking nightmare, a hellish landscape of flickering lamplight, the coppery smell of blood, and the low, pained groans that escaped Silas's lips. Raoul worked with a surgeon's focus, his gnarled, leathery hands surprisingly steady. He sent Ellie to fetch a small leather pouch from his saddlebag, which was filled with dried herbs that filled the cabin with a pungent, antiseptic scent. He probed the wound with a knife he had sterilized in the flames of the lantern, his face a mask of concentration. He told her to hold Silas down, and she did, her arms wrapped around his shoulders, her tears falling silently onto his sweat-soaked hair as his body arched in a silent scream of agony. When at last Raoul extracted a flattened piece of lead and dropped it with a clinical clink into a tin basin, a wave of dizziness washed over Ellie. The old man stitched the wound with a crude needle and gut, his movements swift and sure. He packed the wound with a poultice of chewed herbs and bound it tightly with clean strips of cloth. "Now," Raoul said, finally sitting back, his face glistening with sweat in the lamplight. "The rest is up to God and the strength of His Spirit." The world slowed down. The sun had long set, and outside, the vast darkness of the valley was absolute. Inside the small, warm cabin, time seemed to stretch and warp, measured not by the clock, but by the shallow, ragged rhythm of Silas's breathing. Raoul sat with her through the first night, a silent, watchful presence. He told her he had known Silas's father, that he had promised the man he would keep an eye on the boy in the valley from his small line shack in the hills. "He is a good man," Raoul had murmured, looking at Silas's still form. "Too much like his father. He carries the world on his shoulders and never says a word." When dawn broke, gray and cold, Raoul had to leave. He left her with instructions, his words simple and direct. Keep the wound clean, keep him warm, try to get water, and later, broth between his lips. "And you must talk to him," the old man had added, his dark eyes surprisingly soft. "The spirit can hear, even when the body sleeps." And so began the long vigil. Ellie's world shrank to the 4 log walls of the cabin, to the small, fraught space around the cot, the life she had known before the running, the fear. The constant looking over her shoulder felt like a story from another lifetime. This was her reality now, the constant, low fire on the hearth, the endless boiling of water, the changing of blood-soaked bandages, and the terrifying stillness of the man in the cot. In the corner, Tom created his own small world. The violence had shaken him to his core, leaving him quiet and withdrawn. He spent hours on the floor, a piece of charcoal in his hand, drawing on scraps of paper and smoothed pieces of wood. He drew the cabin, the barn, the horse buck who had returned at dawn, nosing at the corral gate. He drew stick figures of himself and Ellie. He never drew the attackers, and he never drew Silas lying in the cot. It was as if by not drawing it, he could deny its reality. But his small acts of care were their own language. He would appear at Ellie's elbow with a cup of water, his face solemn, or silently leave a piece of cornbread by her hand, a small offering to sustain her. Days bled into one another, indistinguishable. Ellie slept in snatches in the armchair, her senses always attuned to the sound of Silas's breathing. It was her compass, her prayer. As long as it continued, there was hope. She became a student of its every nuance, the shallow hitch, the deep, rattling cough, the long, terrifying pauses that left her own heart frozen in her chest. She did as Raoul had instructed. She spoke to him, her voice a low, constant murmur in the quiet cabin. She told him about her day, about Tom's latest drawing, about the way the light looked on the valley walls in the morning. When she ran out of things to say, she turned to his small shelf of books. There was a well-thumbed copy of Shakespeare, a book on animal husbandry, and a slim volume of poetry. She chose the poetry, and she began to read. Her voice, soft and steady, filled the sick room with words of ancient seas and forgotten kings, of love and loss. She didn't know if he could hear her, but the act of reading was a lifeline for her own sanity, a way to impose order and beauty on the grim, silent struggle for life. On the third night, the fever came. His skin, which had been cool and clammy, grew hot to the touch, his body radiating a dry, dangerous heat. He began to mutter, his head thrashing back and forth on the pillow. The words were nonsense, fragments of memory from a life she knew nothing about. A woman's name, a place called Willow Creek, the sharp command of a cattle drive. Ellie was terrified. This was the crisis, the turning point Raoul had warned her about. She worked tirelessly through the night, a solitary soldier in a desperate battle. She bathed his face and chest with cool water, the steam rising from his fiery skin. She forced spoonfuls of willow bark tea, a remedy Raoul had left, between his cracked lips. She whispered his name over and over, begging him to stay, to fight. As the night deepened and his fever climbed, she knelt by his cot, her hands clasped, and prayed with a fervor she had never known, sending desperate pleas into the vast, silent darkness. Just before dawn, when the lamp had burned low and Ellie's hope had worn to a thin, frayed thread, the change came. The violent shivering stopped. A sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. The heat began to recede from his skin, leaving it cool and damp. He fell into a deep, quiet sleep, his breathing no longer ragged and shallow, but slow and even. The fever had broken. Exhaustion, profound and absolute, washed over Ellie. She slumped into the chair, her head falling back, and wept with silent, shuddering relief. He slept for another day and a night. It was a true, healing sleep. The color began to return to his face, and the lines of pain around his mouth softened. Ellie continued her care, but the frantic edge of her desperation was gone, replaced by a fragile, luminous hope. She found herself watching him, not just for signs of life, but studying the face of the man she had only ever known as a bastion of strength. She traced the line of his jaw, the faint white scar that cut through one eyebrow, the way his dark lashes rested against his cheek. She was no longer just his charge, a piece of trouble he had taken on. She was his keeper. Their lives were now inextricably, intimately bound. It happened in the quiet of the late afternoon. A gentle, golden light slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Tom was outside, his laughter, for the first time in days, ringing as he tried to coax a squirrel down from a tree. Ellie sat by the cot, a needle and thread in her hand, mending a tear in one of Tom's shirts. The cabin was peaceful, the air still and warm. She saw his eyelids flutter. She froze, her needle poised in midair. It happened again, a slight tremor. She held her breath. Slowly, as if they were incredibly heavy, his eyes opened. They were hazy at first, unfocused, the gray irises clouded with the fog of his long journey back. He blinked, a slow, deliberate motion. His gaze drifted to the rough-hewn timbers of the ceiling, then to the window, then to the corner where Tom's drawings were tacked to the wall. Then his eyes found her. The fog cleared, the slate gray sharpened, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she saw the man. Not the patient. He looked at her, his gaze steady and clear. He did not speak. He did not have to. In that single silent look, the world righted itself. It held everything: the confusion of waking, the memory of pain, a question, and beneath it all, a profound, soul-deep recognition. He was back, and the first thing he saw, the first thing he truly focused on in his return to the world of the living, was her. A quiet, unspoken acknowledgement passed between them, more powerful than any words. Her vigil was over. Recovery was a slow, quiet tide, pulling Silas back to the shores of the living. The first days after he woke were a blur of weakness and pain, his world confined to the cot and the small, recurring miracles of Ellie's care. He watched her. It was all he had the strength to do. He watched as she moved through the cabin, her steps now sure and familiar, her presence the one constant, steady thing in his disoriented world. He watched her gentle efficiency as she changed his bandages, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched the way she patiently spooned broth into his mouth, never showing frustration when he could only manage a few sips. He watched her in the evenings, sitting in the armchair with Tom, her head bent over a book, her voice a low, soothing murmur in the quiet cabin. In his weakness, he saw her strength. It was not the hard, unyielding strength of a man like himself, but a different kind, a resilience that was both fierce and tender. He had seen her fight with a shotgun in her hands, her face a mask of terror and rage. Now he saw her fight with a needle and thread, with a boiling pot and a cool cloth, a quiet, tenacious battle against death itself. He had taken her in as a frightened girl, a piece of trouble running from a dangerous past. But as he lay there, helpless, he realized that she was the one who was now sheltering him. Slowly, his strength returned. The day he was able to sit up on his own was a silent victory for them all. A few days later, leaning heavily on Ellie's shoulder, he took his first, shuffling steps to the cabin door, his body weak but willing. He stood on the porch, blinking in the bright sunlight, the fresh, sage-scented air a balm to his lungs. The world, which he had only seen through the small cabin window, was vast and real again. The conversations, at first, were spare and practical. More water, he would rasp, and she would bring it. "How is Tom?" he asked, and she would tell him of the boy's latest adventure. The deep, easy silence they had once shared was now filled with a new, tentative awareness of each other, a slight awkwardness born of their reversed roles. He was the patient, she the keeper. He was the one who was vulnerable, and she was the one on whom his life depended. It was a new and unsettling landscape for them both. The moment came one evening, nearly 2 weeks after the attack. He was finally strong enough to sit on the porch in the armchair she had once claimed, a thick blanket tucked around his legs. The sun had set, and the sky was a deep, velvet curtain pricked with 1,000 diamond-sharp stars. Tom was asleep inside. Raoul had visited that afternoon, nodded in grim approval at Silas's progress, and ridden back to his solitary post in the hills. The valley was theirs, wrapped in a profound and peaceful silence. Ellie sat on the top step near his chair, her arms wrapped around her knees. For a long time, they just sat, watching the stars, breathing in the cool night air. "Ellie," he said, his voice still rough but gaining its old strength. She turned to look at him. In the starlight, his face was all shadows and sharp angles, but his eyes were clear. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple, direct statement, holding the weight of all the days and nights she had sat by his side. She shook her head slightly, a familiar gesture of deflecting praise. Anyone would have... "No," he interrupted, his voice firm. "They wouldn't have... You stayed. You fought." His words, a simple acknowledgement of her strength, seemed to undo something inside her. The careful walls she had built around her heart, the defenses she had lived behind for a lifetime, suddenly felt thin as paper. She looked away from him, out at the vast, dark expanse of the valley. "I've never done that before," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Fought for someone." She drew a shaky breath. "Or trusted someone. Not really. Not since I was a little girl." He said nothing, his silence a patient, waiting presence. It gave her the courage to continue, to give voice to the deepest, most guarded corner of her soul. "My father's betrayal. It did more than just sell me to Mr. Finch," she said, her voice hollow. "It taught me that trust is a fool's game, that love is just a word people use before they take what they want. After that, I learned to see the bargain in everything, the angle, to survive. I had to believe that everyone was out for themselves. It was the only truth I knew." She hugged her knees tighter, a small, self-protective gesture. "And then there was you. You asked for nothing. You took nothing. You just gave shelter, protection. You fought for me, and all this time, I've been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the price to be named, because that's how the world works. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears in the starlight. Her face was a portrait of raw, aching vulnerability. "My heart," she said, her voice cracking with the weight of the confession. "It feels like fallow ground, like a patch of earth that's never been planted, never been trusted to grow anything. It's been locked up for so long, barren and untouched." She leaned forward, her whisper a fragile, desperate plea, the ultimate truth of her existence. A soul like that, it needs the truth. It's the only thing that can take root. The real truth, not pretty words or promises that will blow away in the first wind. The silence that followed was immense. It was filled with the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the night wind. Silas looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were seeing not just her face, but the entire landscape of her broken past. He did not look away. He did not offer a comforting platitude. He simply absorbed the weight of her confession, the profound gift of her vulnerability. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and quiet, but each word landed with the solid, unshakable weight of a stone. "Only yours," he said. Ellie blinked, not understanding. "The truth," he clarified, his gaze unwavering. "I can't give you the world's truth. I don't know it. I can't give you a promise that no storm will ever come. I can only give you my truth, and it will be only for you." He paused, and his next words were the crux of everything, the hinge on which her entire future would turn, if you choose to believe it. He was not commanding her to trust him. He was not demanding it as payment for what he had done. He was acknowledging her wounds, honoring the lifetime of lies she had endured. He was giving her the power, making trust a choice, an act of her own free will. He leaned forward slightly, the movement costing him some effort. "When you stumbled into that boxcar, Ellie, ragged and scared, I didn't see a burden. I didn't see someone to pity." His voice was rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "I saw a fighter. I saw the fire in your eyes, even when you were terrified. I saw someone who had been chewed up by the world but refused to be swallowed." He let out a slow breath. "I didn't jump from that train to rescue some helpless girl. I jumped because I saw someone I wanted to stand beside. It wasn't pity that made me fight for you, here in this valley. It was respect." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of her defenses. He hadn't seen her as a victim. He had seen her as an equal. He hadn't saved her out of charity, but out of a deeper, more profound sense of recognition, of kinship. He wasn't her savior. He was her ally. Slowly, as if crossing a great distance, he reached out his hand. He didn't try to hold her, to embrace her. He simply laid his hand over hers, where it rested on her knee. His touch was warm and firm, his calloused palm covering her trembling fingers. It was not a gesture of passion, but of quiet, solid certainty. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her emotions, a truth made real. She looked down at his hand covering hers, then back up to his face. The tears that had been threatening finally fell, sliding silently down her cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of release. The hard, barren ground of her heart felt a tremor, the first crack in the parched earth, readying itself for the possibility of rain. He had offered her his truth, and in the deep, starry silence of the valley, she chose to believe it. The truth, once spoken, became a kind of sunlight. It did not magically erase the scars of the past, but it allowed something new to grow in the spaces between them. In the weeks that followed their whispered confession under the stars, the rhythm of life in the valley shifted from the sharp, anxious beat of survival to the slow, steady pulse of healing. It was a season of quiet rebirth, for the man, for the homestead, and for the fragile, makeshift family that called it home. Silas's recovery was the metronome for their days. as the deep, angry red of his wound faded to a pale, silver scar. So too did the tension in the air seem to dissipate. With his returning strength came the return of work. But it was a different kind of work now. It was not the solitary labor of a man holding the wilderness at bay, nor the frightened, obligatory chores of a girl earning her keep. It was the shared, collaborative effort of people building a life together. They began with the house itself, patching the splintered holes in the log walls where the attackers' bullets had struck. Silas, his movements still careful, showed Ellie how to mix mud and straw to make the chinking, and they worked side by side, pressing the mixture into the wooden wounds. Their hands, his large and scarred, hers smaller and deft, often brushed in the narrow space, and each touch was a small, quiet acknowledgement, a spark of connection that needed no words. And for the first time since the attack, the sound of Tom's laughter began to echo in the valley again. Freed from the heavy blanket of fear for Silas, his natural boyish spirit resurfaced. He would chase grasshoppers through the tall grass, his shouts of glee a bright, cheerful music that seemed to make the sunshine warmer. He saw Silas, not as a fallen protector, but as his hero returned. And he saw Ellie, not as a frightened stranger, but as the steady center of his new world. His joy was the barometer of their healing, and its clear, untroubled sound was a testament to the safety they were building. One morning, Ellie took a spade and a bucket and walked to the foothills at the edge of the valley. She returned hours later, the bucket filled with clumps of earth and the hardy roots of wild columbine and Indian paintbrush. She had seen them on her walks, vibrant splashes of color clinging to life in the rocky soil, and a quiet, determined idea had taken root in her mind. The earth around the porch was bare, hard-packed dirt, an afterthought to the cabin's stark functionality. It was here that she began to dig. She broke up the unforgiving soil, her hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. It was difficult, physical work, but it felt good, honest. She was not running, not hiding. She was planting. Silas watched her from the barn, where he was oiling a piece of tack. He saw the intent focus on her face, the smudge of dirt on her cheek. He saw her gently disentangle the roots of a columbine and settle it into its new home, patting the earth around it as if tucking a child into bed. There was no practical reason for this. Flowers could not be eaten. They could not keep out the winter cold. But as he watched her, a quiet understanding settled in him. She was not just digging in the dirt. She was claiming this place. She was bringing beauty to their shelter, transforming it into a home. She was planting a flag of hope in the barren soil of their lives. While she cultivated her small patch of life, Silas turned his attention to the fences. The corral fence was sturdy enough, but the old property line fences that marked the valley's edge were in a state of disrepair, with broken rails and sagging wire, monuments to years of solitary neglect. He began the slow, methodical work of mending them. He moved along the fence line day after day, his hammer ringing out in a steady, rhythmic beat. He dug new post holes, his muscles straining with a satisfying ache. He stretched new wire, his hands sure and practiced. To an observer, it was the simple, necessary work of a rancher. But for Silas, it was something more. Each mended rail felt like stitching a wound. Each tightened wire felt like securing a promise. He was not just keeping cattle in, he was defining their sanctuary, creating a clear, physical boundary between the safe, quiet world of the valley and the chaotic, dangerous world beyond. He was mending the broken edges of their lives, creating a space where they could finally be still. Their days were a quiet tapestry woven from these shared tasks. And in the spaces between the work, a new, deeper intimacy grew, expressed in a language of lingering looks and fleeting touches. When he was splitting logs, she would bring him a dipper of cool water from the well, and as he took it, his eyes would meet hers, holding for a beat longer than necessary, a silent exchange of gratitude and care. When the evening chill set in, he would wordlessly take the coat from the peg by the door and drape it over her shoulders as she sat on the porch, his hand resting there for a fraction of a second before withdrawing. They learned the landscape of each other's habits. She knew he preferred the corner piece of the cornbread, and always saved it for him. He learned that she loved to watch the sunrise, and he began to build the morning fire just a little earlier, so the cabin would be warm for her when she woke. These were small, unnamed kindnesses, the quiet affirmations of a bond that was deepening into something as solid and real as the earth beneath their feet. One afternoon, Ellie took out the small cloth satchel that held her past. She untied the leather thong and took out the ledger, its black cover worn at the edges. She sat on the porch steps, the book in her lap, and felt its weight. It was no longer the terrifying object of a desperate flight. It was simply a book, a record of a cruel man's wickedness, a catalyst that had, through a terrifying and painful path, brought her here. She did not open it. She simply sat with it, acknowledging its part in her story, before tying it back in its satchel and placing it securely at the bottom of her small wooden trunk. She was no longer running from it. She was the keeper of it, and it no longer had any power over her. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch as twilight painted the valley in soft shades of purple and rose. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwood tree, carrying the faint, sweet scent of Ellie's newly planted flowers. In the distance, the mended fence line stood as a dark, unbroken promise against the fading light. Tom leaned against Silas's leg, half asleep, while Ellie watched a lone hawk circle in the high, quiet air. No one spoke. There was no need. The comfortable silence was filled with the quiet rhythm of their shared life. The hammer was still. The spade was clean. The day's work was done. They were not fugitives, not a patient and his nurse, not a man and his wards. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by fire and faith. They were no longer running, from the world or from themselves. They were home, and in the deep, rich soil of the valley, their roots were finally, irrevocably, taking hold. The sun was a melting ball of gold, pouring its last warm, liquid light across the valley. It was the time of day when the world seemed to hold its breath. The harsh edges of the landscape softened into long, gentle shadows. The air was still and sweet, carrying the scent of warm dust, the faint perfume of Ellie's columbine, and the promise of a cool, clear night. This time of day had become a sacred ritual. The work was done. The chickens were roosting, their soft clucking fading with the light. Buck, the horse, stood hip-shot and dozing in the mended corral. Inside the cabin, Tom, worn out from a day of grand adventures that involved stalking lizards and helping Silas reshoe the horse, was fast asleep on his cot, one small, dirty hand curled on his blanket. Silas stood at the edge of the porch, leaning against a post, his arms crossed over his chest. He was not the same man who had stumbled from that fight, nor the solitary figure who had first found this valley. His strength had returned, settling back into his shoulders with a familiar weight, but the solitude in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. He was watching the light change on the western mesas, but his attention was not truly on the horizon. It was on the small, thriving world he now inhabited. His gaze drifted over the neat rows of vegetables, the secure line of the fence, the splash of color from the flowers by the porch. He was no longer just a resident here. He was a guardian, a partner in its creation. Ellie stood in the doorway of the cabin, drying her hands on an apron. She watched him for a long moment, this silent, steady man who had become the axis on which her world turned. She saw the new ease in his posture, the way his shoulders had relaxed over the weeks. She saw the silver scar at his temple, a testament to the price he had paid for her safety. She saw the way his large, capable hands rested on his arms, hands that had fought for her, tended her wounds, and built this life alongside her. A profound, quiet certainty settled in her heart. as calm and deep as the twilight settling over the valley. The fear was gone. The frantic, desperate need to hide, to survive, had been replaced by a gentle, powerful urge to live, to build, to love. The truth he had offered her on this very porch weeks ago, his truth. If she chose to believe, it had taken root in the fallow ground of her soul and had blossomed into something more beautiful and resilient than she could have ever imagined. It was time, she knew, to offer him her own. She took off her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. She walked out of the cabin, her footsteps soft on the wooden planks of the porch. He heard her, and his head turned, his eyes finding hers in the gathering dusk. He did not speak, but his gaze was a question, an invitation. She walked to him, stopping just before him, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She looked up into his face, into the slate-gray eyes that had once seemed so cold and distant, but which she now knew how to read as clearly as a printed page. She saw in them the long, lonely years, the quiet strength, the fierce loyalty, and the deep, unspoken tenderness he held for her and the boy. Her own story, her own journey, seemed to unspool in her mind. She saw herself, a ragged, terrified girl, stumbling into a dusty boxcar, clutching her stolen secrets to her chest like a shield. She remembered the sheer animal panic, the desperation of her plea. "That day on the train," she began, her voice quiet but clear, carrying easily in the still air. "I was so afraid. All I could think about was hiding, disappearing. When I saw you, I saw a shadow big enough to swallow me up." She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were warm and calloused, a familiar landscape of hard work and strength. He did not pull away. His hand remained relaxed in hers, a silent permission for her to continue. "I only asked for shelter under your coat," she said, her thumb gently tracing a line across his knuckles. "Just for a moment, just long enough for the danger to pass." It was the smallest space, the darkest hiding place I could imagine, and it felt like the safest place in the world. She looked from their joined hands back to his face. "You gave me that, Silas. You gave a stranger a place to hide, with no questions, no price, and you've been giving me shelter ever since. In this valley, in this home." A gentle breeze stirred, rustling the flowers she had planted. She took a breath, gathering the courage for the final, most important truth. "But I'm not that girl anymore," she said, her voice gaining a new, quiet strength. "I'm not hiding, I'm not running, and I don't just want shelter for a moment." She tightened her grip on his hand, her gaze direct and unwavering. "Now, I just want to stand beside you. Come sun or rain, I want to mend the fences and plant the flowers and watch Tom grow. I want to wake up in this valley and know that you're here." She paused, her heart in her throat. "I want to build a life with you, Silas, if you'll have me." It was not a desperate plea, but a declaration, a statement of her own choice, her own desire. She was not a girl asking for protection, but a woman offering her partnership, her heart, her future. Silas looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the deepening shadows. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of their breathing. He looked at her upturned face, at the strength and honesty shining in her eyes. He looked at her hand holding his, a small, determined anchor. He saw the entire journey in that one moment, the frightened fugitive, the fierce nurse, the quiet homemaker, and now, this strong, brave woman offering him a gift he had long ago decided he would never have. He did not speak. Words were not his language. Promises were fragile things, easily broken by the harsh winds of the world. He dealt in the currency of action, of unshakable, physical truth. Slowly, deliberately, he moved his other hand and covered hers, his large hands completely enveloping her smaller one. He squeezed, a firm, gentle pressure that was not a gesture of possession, but a profound, soul-deep answer. It was a vow spoken without a sound. It said, "I am here." It said, "I am not leaving." It said, "Yes." A wave of pure, luminous joy washed over Ellie, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He squeezed her hand again, and this time she squeezed back. A silent, mutual pact made as the last sliver of light faded from the sky and the first star appeared, a lone, brilliant diamond in the velvet darkness. He did not release her hand. He kept it held firmly between his own as they stood together on the porch, two solitary figures who had found each other in the vast, empty wilderness. The ghosts of the past, the cruel men, the broken promises, the long, lonely years had no power here. They had been burned away by the quiet, steady flame of a love that had been built not on grand declarations, but on shared labor, silent understanding, and the simple, profound truth of a flower pressed between the pages of a book. In that quiet moment, under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the western sky, their love was no longer a secret to be nurtured in the shadows or a hope to be whispered in the dark. It was as real and enduring as the mountains that rimmed their valley, a truth of their own making, a home for their hearts. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to connect with our audience, so please leave a comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story be heard by more people, please consider supporting us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate you all.